The desert of New Mexico in July 1947 was quiet. The summer air was heavy with heat, even at night. The vast plains stretching endlessly beneath a dome of stars. Ranchers tended their cattle, soldiers patrolled their bases, and small towns slept in silence. Life here was simple, predictable, unremarkable. But one night, everything changed. A storm rolled over the desert, lightning tearing across the horizon. In the distance, something cut through the sky. Witnesses would later describe it as a flash, a streak, a burst of light that seemed out of place in the natural chaos of thunder and rain. And then, a crash, a sound so violent it carried for miles across the plains. On the Foster Ranch, 75 miles north of Roswell, rancher Mac Brazel was the first to notice the aftermath. The next morning, as he rode out to check his sheep, he found debris scattered across his land. Not ordinary debris, strange, shimmering pieces of metal, impossibly light, yet impossible to dent. Beams etched with symbols that looked nothing like English, Spanish, or any language he knew. Some described it as foil that could crumple and then unfold itself, returning instantly to its original shape. Brazel had seen weather balloons before. He had seen aircraft wreckage. This was not the same. This was something different, something he could not explain. At first, he told neighbors, and soon whispers spread across Roswell. Something had fallen from the sky, something the government would want to know about. And soon, they did. Soldiers from the Roswell Army airfield arrived quickly. They collected the pieces, stuffed them into crates, and warned Brazel not to speak further. But it was too late. Word had already reached the Roswell Daily Record. On the 8th of July, 1947, the newspaper published a headline that would echo for decades: RAF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. For a single day, the truth seemed undeniable. The Army itself had confirmed it. A flying saucer had crashed in Roswell. But then, just as quickly, the story changed. The military issued a correction, claiming it had only been a weather balloon. Newspapers printed retractions. The debris was gone, the witnesses silenced, and the mystery buried beneath official denial. Yet the echoes of that night never faded. The crash at Roswell became the spark of a legend, a story whispered in diner booths, radio stations, and homes across America. A story that asked a question humanity has never stopped asking: what really fell from the sky in 1947? As we drift deeper into this story, let the desert night surround you. Let the silence of the plains take hold, and follow the trail of fragments, witnesses, and secrets as we unravel the cover-up that began in Roswell. Because the truth, once glimpsed, can never be fully erased. In the days following the crash, the desert ranch north of Roswell became more than just cattle land. It became the first stage of a mystery that would never quite leave the public imagination. Mac Brazel, the rancher who had stumbled upon the wreckage, could not shake the images from his mind. Scattered across the dry earth were shards of material unlike anything he had touched before. Some pieces shimmered in the light, almost like aluminum, but they would not bend, scratch, or break. Others seemed to carry markings, strange symbols pressed into their surface as though they were written in an alphabet that belonged to no nation on Earth. Neighbors who came to see the debris confirmed the same strange qualities. One described how a piece of foil-like material could be crumpled tightly in a fist, only to unfold itself, smoothing out instantly as if untouched. Another spoke of thin beams with purple and violet markings that reminded him of hieroglyphs. But not quite. The symbols were too sharp, too geometric, too deliberate. Brazel, puzzled but practical, decided to alert the authorities. He rode into town and spoke to the sheriff, George Wilcox. Wilcox, uncertain of what to do, contacted Roswell Army Airfield within hours. Soldiers were dispatched to investigate. Major Jesse Marcel, the intelligence officer at the base, was among the first military men to examine the wreckage. He too was struck by the strangeness of the material. Years later, in interviews, Marcel would insist that what he handled was not of this world. It was nothing made by human hands, he said. But in July of 1947, Marcel was still an officer under orders. He collected what he could, packed it carefully, and returned to the base. Brazel was told to stay quiet. Still, Word spread. Roswell was a small town, and secrets never stayed contained for long. The Roswell Daily Record picked up the whispers, and on the 8th of July they ran the headline that changed everything. Rafe captures flying saucer. For a moment, the world tilted. Flying saucers, until then the stuff of pulp magazines and campfire tales, had been acknowledged by the U.S. Army itself. A crash, a recovery, and confirmation that something extraordinary had fallen from the sky. Phones rang across Roswell. Locals told each other the Army had the wreckage. Some swore they had seen trucks loaded with crates, leaving the ranch. Others whispered about bodies, though no proof ever surfaced. But then, almost as quickly as it began, the story shifted. The Army reversed its statement. No flying saucer, they now claimed, just a weather balloon, nothing more. The debris, once so strange, was displayed to the press as scraps of rubber, sticks, and foil. Officers posed for photographs, holding up the pieces as if to say, "See, nothing unusual here." But those who had seen the real wreckage, the ranchers, the sheriff, Major Marcel himself, were left with a gnawing certainty. What they had touched, what they had seen, was not a balloon. And the attempt to explain it away only deepened the suspicion. In Roswell, the first witnesses had spoken. The question now was how long the truth could be silenced. The summer sun burned hot over Roswell as reporters gathered at Roswell Army Airfield. The day before, the world had been told the U.S. military had recovered a flying saucer. Now, barely 24 hours later, that announcement was being undone. Brigadier General Roger Ramey, commander of the 8th Air Force in Fort Worth, Texas, was photographed sitting in his office with the supposed wreckage spread across the floor. Thin strips of rubber, sticks, and torn foil. A weather balloon, he insisted. Nothing more. Major Jesse Marcel, who had collected the debris from the Foster Ranch, stood by in the photographs, looking uncomfortable, as though he knew something he could not say. He had handled the real wreckage, and this was not it. To his dying day, Marcel would insist the material shown to the press was a substitution, a cover story crafted to put the matter to rest. The official explanation spread quickly through newspapers. The Roswell Daily Record printed the correction, the headline that had electrified the nation. Rafe captures flying saucer was quietly replaced by one that spoke of weather balloons and military mistakes. But outside the headlines, the whispers grew louder. Local ranchers swore the debris they had seen was nothing like what was now displayed to the press. Families whispered about trucks carrying crates away from the crash site in the dead of night. Some even claimed that strange small bodies had been taken away under heavy guard. The change in the Army's story only deepened the suspicion. Why announce a flying saucer at all? If it was simply a balloon, why gather reporters, then humiliate your own officers with a correction so sudden and so sweeping for the citizens of Roswell? The truth felt obvious. The military had seen something extraordinary. They had admitted it, then panicked, and now they were scrambling to bury the story. But burying the story would not erase it. The seeds had already been planted. The desert had already given up its secret. And though the Army had tried to stamp it out, the legend of Roswell was already alive. The official explanation would hold for decades, tucked neatly into history books. But beneath the surface, those who had seen more would carry their memories like a weight. Memories of strange materials, sudden silences, and a cover-up that began with a single contradiction. Roswell was no longer just a town. It had become a question the world was not ready to answer. Even as the Army worked to seal the story, fragments of truth lingered in the memories of those who had seen the wreckage. The people of Roswell whispered to each other in hushed voices, always careful, always watching for who might be listening. Mac Brazel, the rancher whose land had become the crash site, was said to have been taken into custody for several days. When he returned, neighbors noticed a change. He was quieter, more reserved, and he rarely spoke of what he had found. Some believed he had been pressured, warned, perhaps even threatened to keep silent. Major Jesse Marcel, the intelligence officer, carried his own secret burden. He had handled the debris with his own hands. The memory of its strange qualities stayed with him for life. He remembered the thin, foil-like sheets that would not crease, the beams with odd violet markings, the sense that the material was stronger than steel, yet impossibly light. But in 1947, Marcel was still an officer under orders. He smiled stiffly for the cameras, held up the balloon wreckage, and let the official story stand. Other locals were less cautious. Some described being shown pieces of the debris before it was seized. One young boy claimed he had tried to cut into a piece of metal with a pocket knife only to watch the blades slide off without leaving a scratch. Another recalled strange symbols like geometric hieroglyphs stamped into the material. None of it matched any aircraft, weather balloon, or weapon they had ever seen. But in Roswell, rumors were dangerous. Soldiers were everywhere. Families whispered that the army had gone door to door, collecting every fragment, silencing every voice. Some claimed their phones were tapped, their conversations monitored. It was a quiet intimidation, but it worked. Most people chose not to speak of it again, at least not publicly. Still, the memory of those strange materials was impossible to erase. And for many in Roswell, the silence itself was proof that something extraordinary had happened. Because if it had truly been just a balloon, why the secrecy? Why the warnings? Why the sudden transformation of ordinary ranchers and officers into men and women who spoke less, who carried a shadow with them for the rest of their lives? The desert had revealed something, and though the army tried to bury it under weather balloons and denials, the fragments of the story refused to disappear. The Roswell crash was becoming more than an incident. It was becoming a legend. One built not just on what people saw, but on what they were told never to repeat. The wreckage was one part of the story. The other was far more unsettling. In the years after 1947, quiet rumors began to circulate around Roswell. Not about metal, beams, or strange symbols, but about bodies. Some locals claimed they had seen military trucks carrying more than just crates of debris. Under heavy guard, tarpaulin, covered stretchers were loaded quickly, shielded from view. Soldiers whispered to each other, their faces pale and tight, as though they themselves were unsure of what they had been ordered to move. A nurse from the Roswell Army Hospital later described being summoned in the middle of the night. She said she had seen small, lifeless forms laid out on gurneys. Their bodies oddly proportioned, their heads too large, their features too delicate. The smell of antiseptic filled the room, but nothing could mask the sense that these were not human remains. Other witnesses spoke of crash sites beyond the Foster Ranch. One tale described a secondary location where more complete wreckage and bodies had been found. This site, too, was quickly secured, and the remains vanished into military custody, never to be seen again. The stories were inconsistent in their details, but consistent in their weight. Everyone who spoke of the bodies described the same unease, the same secrecy, the same warnings to stay silent. Some insisted the remains were flown to Wright, Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, a facility long rumored to house the most secret of government projects. Officially, there were no bodies. Officially, there was no crash beyond a weather balloon. But in Roswell, the whispers told a different story. Too many people, too many quiet voices, repeating the same claim. Something alive had come down in the desert that night, and it had not survived. For decades, these rumors of bodies became the most chilling aspect of Roswell. They transformed the story from a simple crash into something much larger, a secret not just of technology, but of life itself. And once that possibility was imagined that we were not alone, and that proof of it had been taken from us, it could never be erased. After the storm of headlines, retractions, and whispered rumors, the desert grew quiet again. Roswell returned to its ordinary rhythms. Cattle tended, fields plowed, children playing under the wide New Mexico sky. The town seemed unchanged, but beneath the surface, something had shifted. The people who had seen too much learned to stay quiet. Mac Brazel no longer spoke of the strange debris. Families who had once whispered about bodies or glowing wreckage locked those stories away. The Army's presence had been swift and intimidating. Whatever happened that July, the message was clear: do not talk. For the wider world, the cover story held. Newspapers moved on. Headlines shifted back to politics, baseball, and everyday news. The strange headline of the 8th of July, 1947, became a curiosity, a footnote. Flying saucers, the press called them, half mocking, half curious. By the time autumn came, the Roswell crash had faded into obscurity. But the silence did not erase the memory. In quiet homes across Roswell, people remembered what they had seen. Strange materials, secret trucks, soldiers carrying stretchers in the dead of night. And though they did not speak of it openly, those memories lingered, like shadows that could not be swept away. For the U.S. government, the silence was intentional. Files were locked. Witnesses were monitored. Whatever had come down in the desert, it was now buried under layers of secrecy. Only a handful of officials knew the full story, and they were not talking. For more than 30 years, Roswell became little more than a local legend. A story you might hear at the edge of town, told in quiet voices at a diner or a bar, but nowhere else. But silence has its limits. Secrets, even buried ones, have a way of rising again. And as the decades passed, the world began to change. Space exploration, the Cold War, new generations more willing to question authority. By the late 1970s, the silence around Roswell was cracking. And when it did, the story that reemerged would not just revive the mystery. It would transform Roswell from a forgotten desert incident into the most famous UFO story in the world. For 3 decades, the Roswell crash lay buried beneath official silence. The year 1947 faded into history. America moved on. Through wars, elections, the space race, the moon landing, Roswell was little more than a fading whisper. A story told in hushed tones around dinner tables, never fully forgotten but never truly heard. That changed in the late 1970s. A man named Stanton Friedman, a nuclear physicist turned UFO researcher, began digging into the case. He tracked down old witnesses, many of them elderly now. Their memories still vivid, their stories still sharp. And what they revealed reignited the legend. The most important of those voices was Major Jesse Marcel, the very intelligence officer who had first handled the wreckage. By then, he was retired, no longer bound by military chains in the same way he had been in 1947. Marcel spoke openly to Friedman, and later to journalists, about what he had seen. He described material that defied every explanation, metal that was impossibly light, foil that could not be torn or burned, beams marked with symbols that looked like writing. But not from any alphabet he knew. He spoke of the substitution, how the debris displayed for reporters was not the same material he had handled. He insisted, without hesitation, that the Roswell crash was no weather balloon. Others began to come forward too. Neighbors, ranchers, even military personnel who had been on the fringes of the recovery. Their stories aligned in strange and unsettling ways. Trucks moving under cover of night. Secrecy orders issued. People warned into silence, and always the same detail. The wreckage was unlike anything human hands could make. As Friedman compiled these testimonies, Roswell began to shift from a forgotten rumor into something larger. Books were written. Television specials aired. The public, hungry for answers during a time of growing distrust in government, found the story irresistible. By the early 1980s, Roswell was no longer a quiet desert town. It had become a symbol of secrecy, of cover-ups, of the possibility that humanity was not alone. The story, once silenced, was alive again, and it would only grow louder. By the 1980s, Roswell had grown into something larger than an incident. It was becoming a legend. Books poured onto shelves, each one expanding the mystery. Documentaries aired on late-night television, drawing curious eyes and sleepless minds. Talk radio hosts filled the airwaves with speculation, weaving Roswell into the fabric of conspiracy culture. The story had all the elements of myth: a crash in the desert, strange wreckage, whispers of bodies, a government that admitted the truth for one fleeting moment before burying it under denial. For believers, Roswell was not just a story. It was the story, the origin of modern UFO lore. Researchers mapped every detail. They traced the path of debris from the Foster Ranch to Roswell Army Airfield. They tracked the flights that supposedly carried remains to bases across the country. They interviewed dozens of witnesses, building a mosaic of overlapping testimony. Some of the accounts grew stranger over time. Witnesses described crates sealed with tarps, guarded at gunpoint, nurses who claimed they had seen small bodies stored in coolers, officers who confessed their doubts about the official weather balloon explanation. Each story added another layer, another possibility, another reason to question the official line. At the same time, the government remained silent. No new files were released. No explanations given. That silence only fueled the legend. For every question left unanswered, the mystery deepened. Roswell began to change as well. What had once been a quiet town on the plains of New Mexico started to embrace its notoriety. Visitors came looking for answers, or at least for a glimpse of the place where it had all begun. Shops sold alien trinkets. Restaurants adopted space, themed defate core. Roswell, once ordinary, was becoming a destination. The birth of the Roswell legend was not just about what people remembered. It was about what they believed. And by the 1980s, more and more people believed that what had fallen in the desert was not of this earth. The cover-up, meant to silence the story, had instead given it power. And Roswell, once buried, was now impossible to ignore. As the Roswell legend grew louder in the 1980s and 1990s, the U.S. government found itself in an uncomfortable position. For decades, silence had been enough. The story had been buried, ignored, dismissed as fantasy. But now, Roswell was everywhere. On bookshelves, television screens, late-night radio. Millions of people were asking questions, and silence no longer worked. In 1994, nearly 50 years after the crash, the U.S. Air Force released a new report. For the first time since 1947, they addressed the Roswell mystery directly, but instead of admitting to extraterrestrials, they doubled down on earthly explanations. The wreckage, they claimed, had not been a weather balloon after all. It had been part of a classified program known as Project Mogul, a top-secret effort to detect Soviet nuclear tests using high-altitude balloons. According to the Air Force, the strange materials recovered in Roswell were simply components of those balloons: radar reflectors, foil, and sticks. The announcement made headlines, but it did little to settle the matter. To believers, the new explanation only proved what they had suspected all along: that the government had lied in 1947, lied again in the correction, and was still lying now. Why change the story after so many decades if the truth had been simple from the beginning? And the questions did not end there. In 1997, on the 50th anniversary of the crash, the Air Force released yet another report. This one addressed the rumors of bodies. According to the military, witnesses who claimed to have seen alien remains were actually misremembering military crash test dummies used in high-altitude experiments during the 1950s, but critics were quick to point out the flaw. How could memories of 1947 be explained by experiments that took place years later? The explanation felt clumsy, forced, and for many, insulting. The government's response, instead of calming the storm, only intensified it. For every page of explanation, new questions rose. For every official denial, suspicion deepened. And as the 1990s drew to a close, Roswell was no longer just a story. It was a symbol of distrust, a sign that the people were not being told the truth. The cover-up, whether real or perceived, had become larger than the event itself, and the world was listening more closely than ever before. By the turn of the new millennium, Roswell was no longer a question whispered in shadows. It had become a cultural phenomenon. The name itself carried weight. Roswell no longer referred only to a small New Mexico town. It meant UFOs, aliens, and government secrecy. It was shorthand for the unknown. Movies and television shows embraced it. Hollywood dramatized the crash, adding layers of fiction to the fragments of truth. Shows like The X-Files pulled directly from Roswell lore, turning the story into a symbol of hidden knowledge and shadowy conspiracies. Even mainstream news outlets, once dismissive, could not resist covering anniversaries of the event. In Roswell itself, the legend became a way of life. The annual UFO festival drew thousands of visitors from around the world. Streets filled with alien costumes, parades, and conferences. Local businesses leaned into the mystery, alien-themed diners, gift shops, museums, and murals transformed the town into the epicenter of UFO tourism. But beneath the playful costumes and neon green alien signs, the deeper questions remained. Researchers and authors continued to interview aging witnesses, recording testimonies before they were lost forever. Each new account added to the mosaic, pieces of debris hidden away, secret flights out of Roswell, bodies glimpsed under tarps, and officers who admitted the truth privately but denied it publicly. The legacy of Roswell grew not because of what was proven, but because of what remained unanswered. Every denial left cracks, every explanation raised new doubts, and every witness who came forward seemed to carry the same quiet conviction that something extraordinary had happened in the desert in 1947. The Roswell crash was no longer just a moment in history. It was a lens through which people questioned everything else. If the government had hidden the truth once, what else might they be hiding? If technology or even life from beyond our world had been recovered, what would it mean for the future of humanity? Roswell had become more than a story. It had become a mirror, reflecting both our hopes of contact with the unknown and our fears of secrecy closer to home. And as the years passed, the legacy only grew stronger. As the 21st century unfolded, the Roswell story did not fade. If anything, it grew sharper, fueled by new waves of disclosure and curiosity. In 2017, the New York Times published a report that stunned the world. It revealed the existence of a secret Pentagon program, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, or AATP. For years, in quiet offices and classified briefings, the U.S. government had been studying UFOs, now renamed UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena. The article included videos captured by Navy pilots. The footage showed craft with no wings, no exhaust, no visible means of propulsion, objects moving with impossible speed, defying the laws of physics, performing maneuvers no human-made aircraft could survive. Suddenly, the idea of UFOs was no longer fringe. It was serious. Respected newspapers, military officials, and members of Congress were talking about it openly. And when people talked about UFOs, one word always rose to the surface. Roswell could the story that began in 1947 have been the first clue in a larger pattern. Had the government been guarding secrets for decades, slowly allowing pieces to surface only when it could no longer be denied? In Roswell itself, interest surged again. Younger generations who had not lived through the Cold War or the early UFO waves discovered the story for the first time. Social media spread the legend faster than ever, with hashtags, podcasts, and documentaries reaching millions worldwide. Former military officials began to speak more freely as well. Some hinted at material stored in secure facilities. Others suggested that governments knew far more than they admitted. Even NASA and the Department of Defense began forming study groups, acknowledging the reality of unexplained aerial phenomena, without confirming their origins. Through it all, Roswell remained at the heart of the discussion. The crash of 1947 was still the benchmark, still the origin point, still the story that defined every other. 70 years later, the question lingered, louder than ever. What really crashed in the desert? A balloon, as the government insisted, or something not of this earth, hidden away for generations? Modern disclosure had reignited the flame. But the answers, if they existed, remained just out of reach. The desert of New Mexico has held its silence for more than 75 years. The winds still move across the plains. The stars still watch from above. And the land where something once fell remains quiet. But the questions born that summer night in 1947 have never gone away. Roswell is no longer just an event. It has become a symbol of secrecy, of wonder, of possibility. It is the story people turn to when they ask if we are alone, when they wonder what truths might be hidden just beyond their reach. For some, the answer is simple. A balloon, a mistake, a tale exaggerated over time. For others, the answer is far more extraordinary. A crash from beyond this earth, proof that we are not alone, covered up to preserve power and control. And perhaps that is why Roswell endures, because at its core, it is not only about what fell in the desert, it is about us, our curiosity, our suspicion, our hunger to know the truth. It is about how far we will go to seek answers, and how far those in power will go to keep them hidden. The people who first touched the wreckage are gone now, their voices preserved only in testimony and memory. The officers who carried out the cover-up have passed into history. Yet their silence continues to echo. And every anniversary, every new revelation, every leaked file brings the world back to the same quiet desert in New Mexico. What really happened at Roswell? A balloon? A craft from another world? Or something in between, still too strange for us to understand? The desert does not say. The fences stand. The files remain sealed. The truth, if it exists, waits in shadows. But tonight, as you close your eyes and let the story drift into your dreams, imagine the sky over Roswell in 1947. Imagine the flash of light, the streak across the heavens, the crash in the night. Imagine the questions whispered by ranchers, by soldiers, by a nation unsure of what it had just seen. And then remember, these mysteries endure, not because they are solved, but because they refuse to fade. Roswell is one of those mysteries, a story too big to bury, too haunting to forget. So as you drift into sleep, let the silence of the desert carry you. Let the stars above remind you of how much we still do not know, and let the Roswell crash remain what it has always been, an echo of the unknown, lingering in the dark, waiting to be understood. Good night.